Picture a church in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the spring of 1967. The seats are full. The man at the front is not wearing robes. He is wearing a suit that costs more than most people in the room earn in a month. His name is Kenneth Hagin, and he is telling the congregation something that almost no Christian teacher before the 20th century had ever said from a pulpit. He is telling them that poverty is not a condition. Poverty is a sin. More precisely, he is telling them that Jesus, through his death on the cross, purchased for every believer the right to financial abundance, physical health, and material prosperity in this life, and that if a Christian is not experiencing those things, the problem is their own lack of faith, their own failure to speak the right words, to claim what God has already made available. He calls it the word of faith. Others would call it the health and wealth gospel, the name it and claim it gospel, the seed faith gospel. The academic world calls it prosperity theology. From the early fathers to the reformers, to the modern denominations that have formally reviewed it, call it something else. They call it heresy. And here is what makes this particular heresy genuinely fascinating, theologically. It is not a crude invention. It is not some televangelist throwing Bible verses at a crowd and pocketing the donations, though that certainly happened. The prosperity gospel is a systematic theological position. It has a developed doctrine of the atonement. It has a theory of language and spiritual power rooted, however distortedly, in Scripture. It has a view of God and of human authority before God. That follows its own internal logic, which means refuting it requires more than pointing at a preacher's private jet. It requires going to the roots. It requires understanding what this theology actually teaches, where it came from, and what the scriptures it leans on actually say. That is what this video is going to do. And the thesis is this: the prosperity gospel is not a distorted version of Christianity. It is a different religion wearing Christianity's clothes. The cross it preaches is not the faith it demands, is not the faith the apostles described, and the God it presents is not the God of the Bible. He is something far smaller, far more manageable, and far more useful. That word, useful, is the key to everything that follows. Before we examine the theology, we need to understand the soil it grew in. Because the prosperity gospel did not emerge from a careful reading of the Bible. It emerged from a very specific cultural and philosophical context, and tracing that lineage tells you something essential about its character. The story begins not in a church but in a lecture hall. In the 1880s, a movement called New Thought swept through American intellectual and popular culture. Its central claim was that the human mind, when properly trained and directed, has the power to shape physical reality. Think the right thoughts with enough intensity, speak the right words with enough conviction, and the universe, the impersonal spiritual force underlying all existence, will respond. This is not Christianity. New Thought was a metaphysical system that drew on theosophy, on a variety of Eastern philosophical ideas filtered through American optimism. Its proponents had names like Phineas Quimby and Mary Baker Eddy. It did not begin as a religious movement. The object of faith was not a personal God who acts in history. It was a law, an impersonal, mechanistic spiritual law that human beings could activate through correct mental and verbal technique. Into this world stepped a Baptist minister and educator named Essex William Kenyon, who was born in 1867 and spent his formative years at the Emerson College, an institution deeply immersed in New Thought philosophy. Kenyon was no charlatan. He was a sincere man with genuine pastoral concern. But what he did, over a writing career spanning decades, was import New Thought's central mechanism, the creative power of spoken words, activated through disciplined mental focus, into Christian theological language. He called it positive confession. You confess what you believe God has already provided. You speak healing into existence. You speak prosperity. Because words, in Kenyon's framework, were not merely descriptive. They were creative forces with spiritual power that the believer could deploy. This is the root. Everything else grows from it. Kenyon died in 1948, but a young Pentecostal preacher in Texas had been reading his books. His name was Kenneth Hagin, and he would turn Kenyon's framework into a global movement. Scholars have documented in detail, most thoroughly in Daniel McConnell's academic study A Different Gospel, published in 1988, that Hagin did not merely borrow from Kenyon. He plagiarized Kenyon, sometimes word for word, without attribution, the very doctrines. That would define the word of faith movement. Positive confession, the believer's legal rights before God, the authority of faith-filled speech to command reality, came directly from Kenyon's pen. Hagin added his own theological superstructure, and he added something else, a vast institutional reach. In 1974, he founded, over the next 2 decades, the school trained more than 10,000 students in his theology, and sent them across the country and around the world. The movement that became known as the prosperity gospel was not, in any meaningful sense, a grassroots spiritual revival. It was the deliberate multiplication of a single theological. Kenneth Copeland came through Hagin's orbit, so did Frederick Price, Charles Capps, Jerry Savelle, and others. Oral Roberts, who had been preaching his own version of the health and wealth gospel, popularized the teaching through his television ministry and his concept of seed faith, the idea that giving money to God's work, like planting a seed, would yield a supernatural financial return. Roberts himself reportedly offered to refund donations if the promised return did not materialize within a specified period. By the 1980s, the prosperity gospel had found its platform, Christian television. The Trinity Broadcasting Network became its primary vehicle, and through television it acquired a reach that Hagin's classroom could never have achieved. By the 2000s, it had grown softer, more palatable, more motivational. Joel Osteen, pastor of Lakewood Church, the largest church in the United States, became its most visible face. His books do not use the language of positive confession. His sermons do not instruct congregations to repent or speak healing into being. But the underlying architecture is the same. God wants you to have your best life. God's favor produces material blessing. Difficult circumstances are temporary obstacles on the way to victory. The message had been laundered, the mechanism was the same. So what does the prosperity gospel actually teach? First, that faith is a force, not a posture of trust toward a personal God, but a spiritual law, like gravity, that operates according to fixed principles. When a believer speaks words of faith over a situation, those words carry spiritual power that alters physical reality. This is what word of faith teachers mean. When they talk about the power of confession, the words are not prayers directed at a God who chooses whether or how to respond. The words are activators of a spiritual law that God himself is bound by. This is the point. Almost no one who critiques the prosperity gospel emphasizes enough. The prosperity gospel does not merely promise, it fundamentally redefines the nature of faith and the nature of God. In classical Christian theology, faith is the orientation of trust towards a sovereign personal God, who acts according to his own will and wisdom. In word of faith theology, faith is a mechanism that human beings operate, and God's response is the output. The distinction matters enormously. You cannot hold both views simultaneously. They describe different universes. The Greek word the New Testament uses for what we translate as gospel, it is a compound built from eu, meaning good, and angelos, meaning messenger. Euangelion is the announcement of good news, specifically in its first-century context, a royal proclamation. When a king won a battle, a messenger ran ahead with the Euangelion. The Euangelion was not an offer, it was not a self-help program. It was a declaration of what had already happened, issued in the name of the one who had the power to make it happen. When Paul uses this word in Galatians 1 verses 8 and 9, he is operating with exactly that weight. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preached, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Paul does not use this language carelessly. He uses it to describe a situation where the content of the message has been so fundamentally altered that it is no longer the same message at all, only the same word. The prosperity gospel uses the same word. The content is different. Here is the second core teaching, and this one is stranger than most people realize. The prosperity gospel teaches a particular doctrine of the atonement, what happened on the cross, and this doctrine does not resemble what any major tradition of Christianity has taught. In classical Christian theology, whether you hold to a penal, a Christus Victor view, a moral influence view, or some combination of these, the cross is the event in which God, through Christ, addresses the problem of human sin and reconciles broken humanity to himself. The cross is about sin and death and the gap between the holy God and fallen human beings. The prosperity gospel does not primarily. In word of faith theology, the cross is the legal event through which Jesus purchased a comprehensive package of blessings for believers. Forgiveness of sins, yes, but also physical healing and financial prosperity. These are not separate gifts, they are a single package. To be redeemed means to be redeemed from poverty, sickness, and spiritual death together. Kenneth Hagin's book from 1983 is simply titled Redeemed from Poverty, Sickness, and Death. The implication: if the cross purchased your healing and you are not healed, you either lack the faith to receive what is already yours, or you are failing to confess it correctly. The cross has done its work. The problem is you. This is not Christianity. It is a theological system that has taken the cross, the most costly event in the history of the universe, and converted it into a divine guarantee of earthly comfort. It has made the atonement useful. And it has, in doing so, shifted the weight of the gospel from what God has done to what you are now obligated to activate. Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople who died in 407, preached a series of sermons on the parable of Lazarus and the rich man that were so confrontational about wealth that wealthy members of his congregation had him exiled. Twice. His argument, developed across those sermons on Luke chapter 16, was that comfort in this life and comfort in the next are not merely uncorrelated. They can be in genuine tension. The rich man received his good things in this life. Lazarus received his evil things. In eternity, the position's reversed. This is not a prosperity gospel. This is nearly its opposite. Let us go to the text, the prosperity gospel, because it does not invent its proof texts. It finds them and misreads them. And understanding the misreading is more illuminating than simply asserting that it is wrong. The most commonly cited passage in the prosperity framework is 3 John, verse 2. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. Kenneth Hagin called this verse the foundational promise of material prosperity in the New Testament. But 3 John is not a doctrinal treatise. It is a personal letter from the Apostle John to a man named Gaius, opening with a conventional Greek greeting formula. The phrase, I pray that you may prosper, euadousthai in the Greek, meaning to have a good journey or to succeed, was a standard expression of goodwill in first-century correspondence. It is the ancient equivalent of writing, I hope this letter finds you well. To build a systematic theology of divine entitlement to material wealth on a conventional epistolary greeting, it is wishful reading. Another pillar is Deuteronomy chapter 28, the covenant blessings that promised Israel prosperity, health, and military success in exchange for obedience to the Most. The prosperity gospel reads these as timeless promises to all believers. But this requires ignoring the entire structure of what the passage is describing. Deuteronomy 28 is a condition and the nation of Israel, rooted in the specific Mosaic framework. It is the logic of the Old Covenant arrangement. The same chapter that promises blessings for obedience promises catastrophe. And the New Testament is explicit that Christ has redeemed believers from the curse of the law, which is not the same as saying he has unlocked all the material blessings of the Old Covenant for individual Christians in the 21st century. Paul, writing in Philippians 4, says he has learned contentment in every state, in abundance and in need. He does not say he has learned to act, he says he has learned. The word is memetheka, a perfect active indicative in the Greek that describes an acquired disposition, not a default position. Contentment was something Paul had to be taught, and what taught it to him was suffering. Which brings us to the passage the prosperity gospel cannot adequately explain. 2 Corinthians 12. Paul describes an experience of being taken into the third heaven, of receiving revelations of extraordinary magnitude. And then, therefore, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. He prayed 3 times for it to be removed. The Lord's answer, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Whatever the thorn was, scholars have debated this for centuries, with candidates including an eye disease, chronic illness, or a person persecuting him. What is unambiguous is this: God said no. The most fruitful apostle in the history of the Church, the man responsible for most of the New Testament's theological architecture, prayed repeatedly for relief from suffering and was told that the suffering served a purpose. The prosperity gospel has no satisfying account of this passage. Some teachers have suggested Paul's thorn was the result of his own lack of faith. Others suggest it was a special case for apostolic purposes, not applicable to ordinary believers. Both responses require reading material into the text that is not there. The text says Paul prayed. The text says God heard. The text says God's answer was no. And Paul's response was not to confess more vigorously, or to plant a larger seed. His response was to boast in his weakness, because the weakness was the vehicle for a power that did not belong to him. That is an account of suffering that the prosperity gospel simply cannot absorb. It dismantles the entire framework. There is a chapter in the New Testament that prosperity preachers love to quote from the first half and tend to avoid the second half. Hebrews chapter 11. The first 35 verses read like an argument for exactly what by faith, Abraham received a promised land. By faith, Sarah conceived a son past the age of childbearing. By faith, Moses led a nation through a sea. By faith, Joshua's army watched walls collapse. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Armies routed, kingdoms subdued. This is the highlight reel. And prosperity preachers quote it freely. But then verse 35 turns, others were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. This is not the suffering of people who lacked faith. This is the suffering of people so full of faith they refuse to apostatize even to save their lives. And the author of Hebrews makes the point explicit. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. None of them received what was promised. In this life, the text calls this the expected pattern of faith operating in a broken world under the dominion of death. The promise is real. The fulfillment is coming, but the prosperity gospel collapses the already and the not yet into a single category, and calls it now, which is precisely what theologians call an over. It takes the promises of the age to come and tries to cash them in the present age. And when they fail to materialize, it blames the believer. This is not a minor theological error. It is a structural misunderstanding of the entire Christian vision of time and redemption. You need to understand what the prosperity gospel does to people who are suffering, because this is where the stakes become human rather than merely academic. Kate Bowler is a historian at Duke Divinity School who spent years researching and writing the definitive academic history of the American prosperity gospel, a book called Blessed. In 2015, at the age of 35, married, successful, with a newborn son, she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. She did not need to research what prosperity theology says about cancer. She knew exactly what it says. It says that somewhere there is a faith failure. It says that the person suffering has not confessed correctly, has not given enough, has not believed without wavering. It says, in its inner logic, if not always in its explicit language, that the sick person is at fault for being sick. Bowler described what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that theology from well-meaning people during her diagnosis. They wanted me to know that this was the beginning of the best chapter of my life, and I couldn't help but think, is it? She observed something that cuts to the heart of how the prosperity gospel functions pastorally. It provides enormous comfort to people who are currently healthy and prosperous, because it interprets their good circumstances as divine affirmation, and it provides crushing theological weight to people who are not, because it interprets their bad circumstances as personal failure. This is its cruelest mechanism. It takes the moments in life when people most need a God who suffers alongside them and replaces that God with an equation. You get out what you put in. If you are not getting out what you want, you are not putting in enough of the right thing. The God of the prosperity gospel does not weep outside the tomb of a friend. He does not sweat blood in a garden the night before his own death. He does not cry from a cross. He issues instructions for optimal spiritual investment, and he honors the instructions when they are properly followed. That is not the God of the New Testament, and it is not the gospel. The prosperity gospel is not limited to American television. This matters, and we cannot finish this conversation without addressing it. The teaching has spread globally, and it has spread most aggressively into the communities least able to absorb its financial implications. In sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, in parts of Asia, the prosperity gospel has found its most fertile ground among populations experiencing genuine poverty. And the pattern documented by researchers across these contexts is consistent and devastating. Churches grow rapidly. Giving is extracted from people who can barely afford it on the promise of supernatural financial return, and poverty increases, while the preachers become wealthy. A 2025 statement on prosperity theology, signed by church leaders across Africa, described it as one of the most serious doctrinal dangers facing. The Nigerian Baptist Convention's president publicly called it a damaging teaching that departs from the central message of the Bible. The Lizam movement, in an extended theological statement, noted with particular grief that prosperity teaching flourishes precisely in contexts of terrible poverty, that it presents itself as hope in situations of desperation, and in doing so, makes its exploitation of those situations more, not less, difficult to resist. There is something that should make every theologically serious Christian deeply uncomfortable in this observation. A theology born in American affluence, a theology that, in its American context, tells people who are already comfortable that God wants them to be more comfortable. That same theology, exported to communities of genuine deprivation, tells people who have almost nothing that their faith is the problem, that they are poor, because they have not given enough, believed enough, confessed enough. If you want to understand why Paul's language in Galatians chapter 1 is so severe, if you want to understand why he reaches for the word anathema, meaning devoted to destruction, to describe the preachers of a different gospel, you need to hold this image. You need to sit with what a theology does when it places the weight of material circumstances on the conscience of people who are suffering and calls it the Word of God. Here is the question the prosperity gospel forces you to answer. What was the cross for? If the cross purchased health and wealth and material prosperity as the normal expectation of every believer, then Paul is the strangest argument for his own gospel in the history of religion. He was shipwrecked 3 times. He was beaten with rods, flogged, stoned. He spent years in prison. He lists his suffering in 2 Corinthians 11, not to apologize for it, but to present it as the credential of his apostleship. He describes himself in 1 Corinthians 4 as hungry and thirsty, in rags, brutally treated, homeless. He says this while praising the Corinthian church for being kings, and the comparison is not flattering to the Corinthians. If the cross purchased material blessing as a spiritual right, then the early church, most of whose members were poor, most of whom faced periodic social exclusion and economic discrimination, many of whom were martyred, were catastrophically confused about what they had signed up for. If the cross purchased health and wealth, then the entire tradition of the church, including John Chrysostom, who was exiled for challenging the empress's wealth, Augustine, who distributed the monastery's possessions among the poor, Francis of Assisi, who gave and called poverty his bride, was living in stubborn failure rather than faithful obedience. If the cross purchased the right to earthly abundance, you have to explain why the founder of Christianity was born to peasant parents in an occupied province, worked as a tradesman, owned essentially nothing during his public ministry, was killed as a criminal, and was buried in a borrowed tomb. Jesus himself said it plainly in Matthew chapter 16 verse 24, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself and take up his cross, and follow me." The cross was not, in his usage, a metaphor for mild inconvenience. It was the instrument of state execution. He was asking his followers to call that the path to life. This is the gospel, the crucified Messiah, vindicated by resurrection, calling his people to follow him through death to life, not around death, through it, not to their best life now, to a life that transcends now in ways they can barely imagine from inside now. The prosperity gospel has taken this gospel and inverted it. It has made the Christian life about accumulation when the New Testament describes it as about release. It has made faith about claiming when the New Testament describes faith as about surrender. It has made God's blessing about material validation when every major figure in the biblical narrative, Abraham, Moses, David the prophets, Paul, Jesus himself, was shaped by suffering into something no earthly prosperity could have produced. What does the actual gospel offer instead? Not the fantasy of a life without loss. The New Testament does not offer that, and anyone who has read it honestly knows it does not offer that. What the actual gospel offers is the God who enters loss, the God who does not stand outside suffering and issue instructions for how to escape it, the God who walks into a tomb and walks out the other side, not as a demonstration that tombs are temporary inconveniences for people with sufficient faith, but as the promise that death is not the last word about anything. This is a harder word than the prosperity gospel preaches. It offers no formula, it offers no return on investment with a guaranteed yield. It offers the companionship of a God who has suffered more than any human being has ever suffered, who understood abandonment and pain and humiliation in their most concentrated forms, and who says to anyone who will hear it, "I am with you in this, and it will not always be this way." There is a reason the prosperity gospel is appealing. There is a reason it fills stadiums and sells millions of books and attracts people who are genuinely desperate for hope. The desire it is exploiting is real. The need it is addressing, the need for assurance that suffering is not meaningless, that the universe is not indifferent, that God cares about the material conditions of human life. That need is not illegitimate. The problem is not the need, the problem is the answer being offered. An answer that works only when everything is going well is not an answer. It is a flattery. And a God who can only be found in your abundance is a God who cannot be found in 2/3 of human experience. The God of the New Testament is findable in the abundance. He is also findable in the prison, in the shipwreck, in the thorn that will not be removed, in the request answered with silence, in the borrowed tomb. He is findable because he has been in all of those places himself. There is a verse in 2 Corinthians 4 that sits, I think, at the furthest distance from the prosperity gospel, while still speaking to everything it is trying to address. Paul is writing from inside circumstances that would, by any prosperity metric, be evidence of spiritual failure. He is describing his ministry as carrying a treasure inside an ordinary clay jar. A clay jar, cheap, disposable, the most commonplace container of the ancient world. And he says the point of the clay jar is precisely that it is a clay jar We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. The power is real. The treasure is real. But the container is deliberately ordinary, deliberately fragile, deliberately the kind of thing that cracks and chips and breaks. Because if the container were gold, you would not be able to tell where the container stopped and the treasure began. This is the logic the prosperity gospel cannot hold. It needs the container to be gold. It needs the visible circumstances to confirm the invisible reality. It needs success to prove blessing and health, to prove righteousness and wealth, to prove God's favor. But the actual gospel insists that the cracked jar is the point, not in spite of what it contains, but because of it. 2,000 years ago, a group of Galilean fishermen and tax collectors and women of means, led by a man who was executed as a criminal and who they claimed had walked out of his own grave, began making an announcement that changed the architecture of the world. They were not wealthy, they were not healthy by any modern standard. Several of them died violently for what they were saying, and the announcement they were making was not, "God wants to give you your best life now." It was something simpler and stranger and far more demanding. It was, "Death is not the end, and the one who defeated it is inviting you to follow." If that announcement is true, then there is nothing the prosperity gospel offers that competes with it. Not health, not wealth, not the accumulated material comfort of an entire human lifetime, because none of those things outlast death. And the gospel is precisely about what does. If you have been sitting in a church where suffering was interpreted as your spiritual failure, if you were told that your illness was evidence of weak faith, or that your financial struggles meant you had not given enough, or that your doubts were the reason your prayers were not answered, hear this: that is not the gospel. That is a theology designed to make God useful. And the actual God of the New Testament is not useful. He is not manageable. He cannot be activated by the right technique, or the right confession, or the right donation. He can only be trusted. Paul learned contentment in plenty and in need, not because he mastered the spiritual law of positive confession, because he met in the middle of his suffering a God who said, "My grace is sufficient, not my abundance, not my material provision, my grace, sufficient." That word, sufficient, is not the word of a God who is offering you everything you want in this life. It is the word of a God who is offering you himself, and insisting that he is enough. He is. If this is a question you have never been given the space to take seriously, stay with it. And if someone you know has been told that their suffering is evidence of their faithfulness deficit, share this with them, because the theology they were given is not Christianity, and they deserve the real thing.